This is not a presentation, this is a story. I have learned that stories are important instead of having boring presentations. So this thing is a story about why backups are important. It is not a presentation. My name is Khawar Nehal. I have more than one company. One of them is ATRC, which is the acronym for Applied Technology Research Center, and another one being promoted these days is called Remote Support LLC. And they do mostly IT related stuff, a little bit of energy and a little bit, used to do a little bit of water for a while. But basically it's something like 95% computer related stuff and 5% everything else. But I do spend a lot of time in other stuff. Anyway, now back to, let's talk about the story that I need to finish. There is a saying of my own that if you have only one copy of your data, then that data is not important. And the reason is, it's very low cost. And since the 1980s, the computers and the desktops and the laptops, mobile devices are so low cost, and the media itself is so low cost that having like 2 copies or multiple copies is not such a big deal. I mean, it's almost negligible compared to how if your data is important, and it's almost negligible in cost. So, okay, the standard is 4 copies these days for regular data, which we can have another video on explaining that. But we will continue the story. Here we go. Okay, so the media, usually it stays for about 5 years. There will be people saying there's media for 1,000 years and this and that, but don't depend on it. So basically, from my experience over the past more than 30 years of using computers, the media lasts for about 5 years. And in that time, within 5 years, you better refresh it. I do a refresh of my data. I used to do it for DVDs. I used to do it 1 to 2 years. If it's important data, keep it to 2 years. That means if you have been storing it in the media for a while and it's important data, make sure you have a process to make another refreshed copy in every 2 years max, if it's important data. If it's common data, you can have 5 years. And it also depends on the media, so you better be aware of how long your media is. So do ask the questions, like if you're using AI these days and you're the next generation who's been born around after the year 2000 and you're not aware of how long your media is going to last, whatever media you're using, you have to ask. You can ask AI these days. You can also ask technical people who have experience, and you can ask what the the duration of that media is for whatever you're using. Media will keep on changing, and the other issue is formats also change. For example, we had VHS tapes. Nowadays we have got movie files, and people don't somehow, they might put it on YouTube, and then YouTube itself is not guaranteed to survive. The reason is YouTube is a private company, and if it dies, all the data is very likely going to be not available. So I've seen people put information in a Facebook chat. I'm talking about passwords and all. One time I went to a customer and I asked them for the FTP password for their website, and the guy opened a Facebook chat with their web developer, and they were not talking at that time, but he said in the history of the chat they had the the FTP password. So we won't recommend that as a way of storing important data. Anyway, so we have VHS tapes, magnetic data tapes, CDs, DVDs, hard disk, USB flash drives. The thing is, these around 10 years, you can expect the media to go kaput. Kaput meaning people will move on. If you're using VHS tapes, there was a stunt that Sony did, but Sony tries stuff because they want to be different, like Apple. And they had Betamax. They tried. They couldn't make it. Anyway, so it's good to try new stuff. Sometimes it works. The DDS was a very good idea. The Sony made a lot of work after Betamax. They went into using the Betamax technology. They were able to make DDS, which is useful because DDS was used for tape drives, and it worked quite well. So sometimes it pays off. Okay, degradation rates are different for most media, so you better get an idea what it is, as I mentioned. Okay. Yeah, degradation rates are different. The toughest media I know, that just on the top of my head, is engraving into rock. For example, the Rosetta Stone. There was a movie in the Conan the Barbarian. I was thinking of putting this scenes into this thing, so I'll find it and put it in maybe in the editing part. The Superman was using his laser vision to write into stones. I think it was in the cartoon, not in the movie. And the stone tablets, I'm not sure if they were actually written like that directly, or they were described and then written. But those are just examples of, if you write into stone, it sort of survives a while. And there is other media which is totally indestructible, but I'm not going to discuss it because I don't know exactly how it works. I know it exists, but it's pretty tough to know much about that. Anyway, so examples of mess up. So in this story, I will start with my own example, which I was thinking of using. I noticed this, that why I am pretty interested in backups and why I care so much about backups and data backups. I think it's related to my childhood. I was in 8th grade. I wrote a program for an assignment. This is using computers in those days. In those days, there was an Apple II. The amount of RAM was like 16 kilobytes. The maximum RAM, if you could find a computer, was like 64 kilobytes, but that was not so common. And the CPU speed was 1 megahertz. The floppy drives could hold 140 kilobytes of data, and no hard disk was available. Hard disk came after that. The times when we are talking about, hard disks were not there at all for desktops. IBM was working on them for mainframes, but you couldn't think of having a hard disk for a desktop. And we were very happy with those configurations somehow. We used to do a lot. Believe it or not, we used to work on making digital movies on a 64 kilobyte computer with 1 megahertz CPU. This is, you might find this unbelievable, but we were actually doing that. I think there was a program called Take-Two that we used to use for that. There were multiple programs. We used to have one for editing the videos, one for editing the images, but they're very hard to believe. Well, anyway, back to the point of backups. There was no save as option. That came in the 90s and after. But you could copy files to another name on the disk. Or even on the same floppy, you could have another file with the same data, and you just say copy to, like from this file to another file, and you just give it a different name. And the operating systems in those days, it was called a disk operating system. And the reason is because that's all they used to do. They managed the files on the disk. They used to track what the name of the file is, where it is located, and so on. So long story short, I wasn't careful. I haven't been using computers just maybe like 1 year or so. I was not careful and saved a few short lines. I wrote another program and accidentally saved it on the same file. And I lost my long assignment. And the only thing I had was a printout and whatever changes I had last done in my memory. This is brain memory, not some neural link type memory, which might start becoming common, and people will think that their memory is similar to their brain memory because it's too close. Anyway, okay, so in a hurry to get the program back, I spent all the time I had access to the computers I had to type the program back in. So there were many areas in the school where they had computers. They had the computer labs, but they also had in the science, and there are different modules for different topics. Like there was a science module, there was a maths module, there was arts module, things like that. The school was designed in a pretty modular type of way. And in the science module, in the center, they had computer. There was one computer available for the science teachers. And since I was a nerdy type student, I had special permissions, and I was using the only computer inside the science module. And this is located in the middle of the module. There's classrooms are on the side. There are like 6 classrooms. It's a hexagonal module, and sort of like a, honeycomb shape. Okay, I have a picture of that place, and I can put that in maybe later. I was using the lone computer and the science module, and that's where the supplies are stored, and the teachers and the staff have a meeting area. And this was actually the supplies area, and that's where they had this computer. And what happened is the computer was dedicated for the science teachers. And remember, I was a student class 8. I wasn't staff or teachers, but since I was nerdy, I had access to it. Now what happened is I got at least, I think, more lunchtime or something else loaded. Somehow I was able to get at least 2 hours on this. And while I had that time, I was so intent on typing this thing back that I did not notice that there was a little bit of central air conditioning, air blowing directly to my lower back area. And due to that, something froze, and I was not moving around while I was typing this thing. So what happened is something froze, and due to that, I had, like when you have a frozen shoulder or something, your neck is frozen and it pains when you move it. So I had a pain for over a decade because of that. It was also a small sharp pain, like a needle. Sometimes you feel it whenever that muscle moves. And this pain somehow helped me remind me over decades to remind me of the importance of backups, which is the point of this story presentation. The pain is now completely gone, but since for maybe, around 20, I think up to 20 years ago, but it lasted for like 15 to 20 years. Now I'm over 50 years old, just to inform you that I'm talking about really old time. So, but having that sharp needle-like pain, which reduced over decades to 0, is the reason why I'm now telling you about it, because I think that was one of the things that somehow put it into my head that backups are important, and if you don't have it, you can have a pain for more than a decade because of that. Since then, I used to have all important stuff in at least 2 floppies and also multiple copies with different names for files. That was for floppies in those days. These days, more than 10 years ago, they started having the save as option, so I use the save as option. And the file formatting is like this. For example, this presentation, the file name is saved as why backups are important -21 December 2024 -2. Currently it's -2 because this is second version for today. After like 5-10 minutes or like every time we have this habit, it's not like I have to think about it. I just say every 5 to 15 minutes I would do a save as, or whenever we are switching to something and you'll suddenly do a save as. There are multiple reasons for this format. The first one is backup softwares. When you're copying files from one computer to another or to another media, what will happen is the backup softwares and the operating system the backup softwares look at the operating system time that is put inside the file. There's a file creation time, there's a file access time, there's a file modification time. Access is when you read it, or modification is when you write to it, and creation time is when it was first created. So these numbers are available to the backup softwares that are doing the copy. So sometimes your computer might not be connected to the internet and might not have access to NTP, which is common these days. So the new generation people are always looking at computers and mobiles, and they never set the date and time. But there are many devices that are not necessarily connected to the internet, and they will not be able to get the time automatically. And if there's any issue with their battery, which is on the motherboard or any kind of device, it will default. Generally, the operating systems will decide to default to 1st January 1970, 12 o'clock in the morning. Starting of the 1st of January 1970. And this is what happens to a lot of devices or computers when they lose the date and time. And if this is true, then the new file will actually be having a date of 1970. Okay, now what will happen is if you tell the operating system, the backup softwares, to consider that, you will end up having your new file either not being copied or some other file being copied onto it which is older. So this is the main issue. You can have new files with a 1970 date. This is still going to happen in any case where the operating system does not have access to the time, and the user is not careful and the time and date are off. There are many other reasons why the date might be wrong, but basically you can assume that there are many cases where the date can be wrong. So what I do is I save it with the date and time like this. So when I'm doing a backup, and if I'm just copying files, it's like the option will give me like, do you want to replace, do you want to overwrite, do you want to update? If newer, update if the size is different, or you want to copy missing files. With all of these options, I can pick any one. I'll still be safe. Okay, so usually I just say copy missing files. This is what I use. But in cases when I'm doing a backup with files which might be interrupted or partially copied, and there are cases where we got gigabytes of files or really huge files, I would say use this one, which is update if the size is different. And for very large file backups which have very large files, I would do something else. We can discuss the backups in another video. I just want to stick to this point right now. But that's another topic of how backups are to be done, in the details of how the settings are for different types of backups. Anyway, so for programs and HTML files which need one name, that means like index.html is an important name. It has to be index.html. You cannot just change it and expect the web server to find some other file. So in that case, I will save as index.html, for example, 21st December, the 7th version. And I would also make another copy over the original index.html. So I always have the index.html, which is a single file. This is being used, but I will always have these versions available. And you can, now the thing is, space is not an issue these days, because the hard disk, since IBM came up with the GMR head technology, hard disks have reached terabytes. So terabytes are huge compared to the kinds of files we have. So you can have multiple versions, and you can let them grow, and every time, whenever you feel like it, if you're in some folder or directory, you can actually just delete some of the old versions. You can see them because the date is right inside the file name. So you don't have to, but you can if you want to. So it's just sort of like optional, that if you want to reduce the list of the file for any reason, you can get rid of all the old ones. Not all of the old ones. You can leave several fewer versions behind, but you can, that's always an option. So now I'm on the 14th slide in this presentation, and the file name has reached version 3, which is the third version. There is also autosave, which is activated when available for applications. Some applications have an autosave, but since we are using our method, we don't depend on it, but if it's available, we do activate it. For example, this is LibreOffice, and it has an autosave option. So in the options area, you go into load save in general, and then you see this option which says auto recovery information every 10 minutes. The reason I leave it at 10 and not reduce it to 1 minute is because my presentation files might be huge, and I don't want this interrupting the work. If you have a very large presentation and you save auto recovery every 1 minute, you might actually start noticing it when every minute it says, can I have a few seconds to save it, which you don't want to have any kind of interruption. So this kind of stuff can be discussed in the settings for backups to have the least interruption to the users while you're doing backups. Okay, so here it is, the example is 10 minutes in autosave, but there is no depending on this. Basically, we don't depend on the power, that is the electricity, to be reliable, and that's another reason for having all of these methods. Now, after giving the examples of my mess ups, now I'll give examples of others, but I will not name the people, because this is just to inform you that it is a real story, and this is actually how people do work, and what the results are, and what you can learn from them. So there was an office employee who did data entry for like 15 years into an application. The details, as I said, are not required for this case. I used to visit them sometimes, and I used to visit maybe like once a month or so. Maybe sometimes within a week, or maybe something, but I was not, over those 15 years I might have visited maybe like 5-10 times or 20 times, but that's it. but that's not enough to do backups. Whenever I used to visit, I used to use their computer for some programming while I was waiting, and they were not using it at that time. And also I used to do their backup of all their data, which is only one app they had, and it was the only app they used. But because that was the only app they used, and I knew the backup procedure, I used to tell them you should do it. But since they didn't, I knew they didn't use it, do the backup, so I used to do it for them whenever I visited. And these were times when computers were not so common. So I used to tell him, like, you need to do the backup. So he did data for entry for 15 years. And one day the hard disk failed and all the soft copy was gone. He did have about 1.5 meters of printouts, which is like, whenever I used to talk about backups, he said, no problem, I got a printout. And I was like, yo, this printout is 1.5 meters high. High means from the ground to the desk level or above desk level. That was a stack of sheets. We are talking about 1.5 meters thick. That's thousands of pages. Okay, so and over the years, maybe the importance of that app and the data was not so important, so they weren't too worried about it. But the lesson to learn is, if they did wanted that, it was just a few minutes to feed about 5 floppies into a desktop, and the cost of the floppy is almost negligible compared to retyping all of that data and fixing all the thousands of links. I mean, he had links between these records, and only he knew a lot of those links. And he came up with fancy ways of using that app to do stuff that he wanted done, but some of the functions were not available in that. But he was dependent on all of those links that he created between the records. So by my analysis, the backup cost would be negligible compared to over 1 billion times more of resources would be required to get that data typed back in, and all those links that he created, indexed and whatever. So getting that data back to in a form that he actually used to use would have been like 1 billion to 1. So it's important to know that backups are not that expensive. I mean, you're talking about 1 billion times more effort to get your data back. Now we'll come to the example of clouds. Google is, from our point of view, we consider them to be very professional in the way they run computers. In the 90s, we might have been some of the first admins to cool modems with fans and run servers without air conditioners at ambient temperatures up to 55 degrees. The reason is, most of these things were done in Karachi, and Karachi can reach up to 45 degrees Celsius in ambient, and the ACs might not be running, because in those days, especially in the 90s, the electricity used to conk out a lot more, so running ACs on generators and UPSs was not an option in those days. Nowadays we have UPSs which can run ACs, and we have ACs which can run on UPSs, but that was not an option in those days. So if the room was closed, it could reach up to 55 degrees or more. So we had to design computers that were able to handle 55 degrees easily. And the way we did this was use at least 4 U-size cases and make sure there are plenty of fans inside them. And also we had fans in the modems. Now, Google did similar. They also started in the 90s, and they figured this out too, that you really don't need to have small, thin, one-use type servers and have 42 of them in a rack. What you need is, you need to leave them open and have the airflow moving. So they did all of that, having the fan movement. So they have an ambient temperature of 25 degrees Celsius, and the fans move the AC, the air through the hardware, and it becomes 70 degrees Celsius, which they move out of the building. And then they also put their building in colder areas like Colorado, where they can get colder air from the outside. And then they also eliminated the VGA card, they eliminated the power supply and the casing. The VGA card can be replaced with a serial port, which you use to get your Linux running. The power supply can be replaced with DC rails, that means just DC power going directly to the motherboards, and the casing with just a rack which can hold the motherboard. So this is the hardware side, but when it comes to the software side, they don't skimp on software. We have a saying, not my own, but somebody else came up with this, which is you can either make the user sweat or the programmer sweat. When it comes to Google, they make the programmer sweat 100% of the time. So from that point of view, they're serious. But when it comes to backups, I got a reminder about a decade ago. I was using Android, and due to some mess up either by me or Google or both, I mean the design of Android at that time and whatever, I don't know what I did exactly, but I lost the address book on the mobile. And that was a reminder that when it comes to cloud backups, you can have the best cloud provider, but then the responsibility of your data is your own. Cloud suppliers will specifically have mentioned in their service agreements that they are not responsible for the, they might have backups, but they won't be ever taking responsibility for that, because if something goes terribly wrong, they still know that they can lose data, and they do not want court cases, so they will say that in the agreement, they'll say, we're not responsible for that. You need a separate backup provider which will do the backups, and even those guys will say like, okay, we'll do the backups, we'll do the best we can, and that will help you have a better reliability, but you cannot get 100%, and nobody will ever offer 100%, and nobody will agree to it because of legal issues. So for the case of the address book, I started using Super Backup, which is actually a software available for Android, which takes all of your contacts data and converts it into a file which you can actually have it regularly backed up onto another computer. So I made the habit of doing that. Now we will, in the future, we'll be automating this process for ourselves, and not really for ourselves, but we need it for the customers. For me, it's not such a big deal. But if we have a lot of mobiles, so we'll be working on that, and so that we basically we have another brand or company, you could say, called Heavy Data Backup, which is dedicated just to backups, and we develop new methods of automating all of these backups of different applications and different types of data, so that the users don't have to worry about it. Okay, so I've put the logo of Super Backup on this slide, which is this one. So you can easily see it in the Play Store or F-Droid or F website area if you need to download something which actually is known to work for backing up the contacts. It can back up other things too, but basically I use it for contacts because that's usually what people want to have around. So this story is getting a bit pretty long, and I've got millions of stories, and this story also has got a lot of other things that I can put in, but I'll reduce it. I'll stop for now, and then I'll spend time in making, continuing this and other stories later in other videos. And inshallah, I'll be making more videos to explain a lot of stuff, and we'll be coming up with more products and services. We already have a lot of computer products and services built over the last 30 to 40 years, and these products and services are used to help help people use their computers better for their benefit and the benefit of their customers and their employees and other people. If you found this story interesting, please provide feedback. My email address is khawar@atrc.net.pk or khawar@remote-support.space. I would love to hear from you. Thank you. Yeah, here's a slide for the thank you. Okay. Now, tell me which languages you need this translated into if you have a spatial requirement for a spatial language, and I'll try to do my best in getting it translated.